hello everyone. Welcome to the podcast. This will be broadcast on not only on YouTube for senior safety advice and aging in place directory, but also on both podcasts as well for senior safety advice and aging in place directory. So today we have someone just a little bit different, not so much a clinical product or a clinical service. Well, it is a clinical service actually, but it's very, very beneficial for everyone. So we have Michael Uzar, and he is the founder of Rehab Risk Consultant. He is a healthcare risk management consultant, but he started off as a physical therapist. So, Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Esther. Look
So,
forward to it.
how did you move from, well, first of all, what brought you to physical therapy? And then what took you from physical therapy to risk management? How did that whole process happen?
I kind of stumbled into both, really. I mean, I was working, I wasn't exactly sure what direction my career was going to go in. My parents worked in healthcare. My dad happened to work in physical therapy, but I wasn't really interested in that right out of the gate. I was working in a hospital. I was a custodian, and then I was an orderly, and I was working on the floor where they did total hip replacement and total knee replacement. So I got kind of some exposure to that. And I said, well, geez, I'm already kind of so close in this realm. Let me go into physical therapy. It seems cool. I already kind of knew a little bit about it. It's kind of physical and mental. So I went that path. I worked as a physical therapist assistant, and then I worked as a PT. And I then from there, really into the clinical stuff and treating patients in all sorts of different settings, inpatient, outpatient, home care, kind of did all the things I felt like. And I really enjoyed it, but I was hoping to kind of have an impact that was a little bit more broad than just one-to-one patient care. And I stumbled into the role of clinical risk manager for a larger health system that I was working for. I think I got lucky. They kind of took a chance on me, and it seemed to work out pretty good.
Wow. Well, it seems like it was a good stumble.
Yeah.
Sometimes when you go into something you never thought of, it's it's all, I always tell everyone that they should do internships because you don't really know all the jobs that are in a field until you're actually working in there. And, going to college or school, you probably never even thought of risk management.
And especially in healthcare too, in healthcare, because you see everyone knows all the direct care roles, right? Everyone knows that nurses and doctors and
Sure.
PTs and OTs, most people know that stuff exists, or they've encountered some level of care that way. But then when you see how large health systems operate, there's a whole group, multiple group and departments that are behind the scenes doing work, compliance and the
Right.
legal department, patient experience. And so there's a lot that goes into the ultimate delivery of care that's not necessarily patient facing. And I kind of got exposure to that once I jumped into risk management.
Wow. Well, then who knows where you'll go next? Let's just stay here and move on. So in your work with clinic, now do you work with very large clinics, small, medium, what, do you have a specialty or that doesn't matter?
The bulk of my experience in risk management thus far has been in large healthcare organizations, mostly nonprofit. And what I decided to do was to go out on my own because I felt like, hey, there's a lot of small businesses and mid-sized businesses that could use these frameworks and techniques and support services to help in their practice growth or in their day-to-day operations. So I said, let me create my own independent consulting company where I deliver this type of service on a micro level, the amount that you need it in a small and mid-sized practices. So the focus with the business is mostly small and mid-sized practices, although I do some consulting with larger care organizations and their risk management.
I would imagine that it's going to be quite fruitful because these days it seems that there are more physicians moving into concierge care.
There is a lot more clinicians of all sorts of types that are going out on their own. They've become a little bit tired of the demands, whatever they may be. It could be documentation demands, it could be high patient caseloads, and they're kind of pushing the pushing the envelope on what's available for them in terms of what they can do for work and how they can deliver their care to their patients. So you see a lot more of that. I mean, you even see it with like the med spa industry. You see it with occupational therapists going in and doing different work in the homes where they're offering recommendations on home assessments and like your resources that your community utilizes.
Exactly. So what do you see are the most common blind spots that lead to risk in a lot of these facilities? Or
Yeah, I think that a lot of times we think of the big risks and the big cases that are going to get us sued where we made a mistake and it caused somebody harm. But a lot of the work I do in terms of education is preparing business owners to be able to look at a situation and know that they may be able to handle this with more transparency to a patient that will have or a client that will have impact on their reputation and
Hmm.
strengthen the relationship with that client because it's not necessarily a liability risk thing. It's more so a patient experience or client experience. And I see a lot of business owners who will tend to have something that went wrong, an adverse event, an unsatisfied patient or a client. And the natural reaction is to kind of run from it or wait or hope that it goes away on its own. But the downstream effects on that later on are on the reputation and the potential for someone to think, wow, they must have really did something wrong if they're not answering my call when I wanted to tell them about, this thing that they did that's no longer working, this treatment that caused me harm, or this adjustment to my home that didn't work out, or I slipped and fell, or things like that. So I think one of the big benefits in knowing where your risks are is to be able to move a little bit more freely and differently when you did have something go wrong, but you understand that this is not likely something that's going to end my business. And I should swiftly act to try to meet it head on and offer a conversation, more so transparent conversation. I will say that when I first got into risk management, it dawned on me just before I took the role in the period between leaving my other role and starting the role in risk management. I thought, geez, I hope this isn't, covering things up and really trying to hide and, aspects of deceit or anything like that. And it really isn't, especially in these large organizations. The ones that do it best offer explanations of what went wrong. They review cases, they offer transparent conversations, and it works out for both parties because your clients and your patients are more satisfied and they strengthen the relationship. And also, you're less likely to receive a liability claim related to that event.
I mean, that is so true. As an internet marketer, I get a lot of questions about people saying, should I respond to this negative review or email or comment? And I always say, yeah, respond to it, because if you don't, it doesn't look good. You
Yeah.
need to respond to it and tell your side of the story or explain or apologize or whatever, own it. But yeah, that sounds exactly right. Do you think there are differences in the risk management um, recommendations that you give for larger organizations versus smaller ones, or are they basically all the same?
There can be some big differences in that when you work in a large organization, there's usually a robust team of people that are available to review what went on, looking at the medical record, interviewing and investigating, talking to the people who were involved. There may be a designated team who's trained in having conversations with patients directly because they deal with a larger volume of cases. So they oftentimes have a very structured approach with how they're going to manage a complaint when it comes into a department or it's handwritten in or they're on if it's inpatient and they're on the floor and they complain to their doctor and then the doctor goes and tells patient experience or patient relations. So the large organizations typically have more structure and the ability to review and respond in a more structured way. And what I really like to see some of the smaller and mid-sized practices do is pare down an approach for how they're going to manage that with even if it's a limited amount of staff members, but have somewhat of a standardized approach so that you can protect your reputation, protect your clinicians' licenses, and protect you from, liability claims. But so there is a difference because you might not have 10 doctors who are going to review this case to determine whether or not there was actual a deviation from the standard of care, we would say. But you can still have these processes of managing how you handle a complaint, even on a very small business, two therapists, two contractor, whatever it is. you can still have an approach that suits your business, and then it really helps you as you grow. Because what I do see is some of these businesses start small and they experience tremendous growth in a 5-year period. You go from a solo practitioner to now having 25 employees in a matter of 4 or 5 years, but you don't necessarily have the infrastructure and you don't have the money to hire somebody full time to work on, standard of work and establish all your policies. So you wind up using, some kind of, cookie cutter policies, which, are better to have than not. Don't get me wrong.
Right.
Um, but there is some benefit to having them tailored to your business. It makes
So,
growing a little easier, I think.
yeah, I mean, you're right. A lot of small businesses that I've worked with do not have any standardized protocols or anything. It's, fly by the seat of your pants at the moment. So do you help them with that, or do you guide them as to where they can get that kind of help?
I do. So typically what I'll do is, learn a little bit about the business, learn about what their pain points or what the service that they're delivering to figure out, hey, these are the most risky things you do. And then try to say, you know what, we don't have to create an entire comprehensive plan in 30 days. And we don't have to make 10-page policies, but maybe these are the 2 or 3 policies you want to start with. Maybe you want to have a framework for how you manage a patient complaint, or maybe you want to make sure that your informed consent process is wrapped up and that everybody's, providing informed consent for the service you're going to provide, and how to have those conversations, because oftentimes it's more than just, hey, here, sign this document that we've been using for 15 years. It hasn't been updated. But having, figuring out where the risks are, and then, taking a bite-sized approach to make it manageable so that, there's somewhat of a framework in place. So yeah, I do help businesses with that. And they have unique risks depending on the services that they provide.
Of course. And when there are issues with, I mean, anytime you're dealing with the public, you're going to be dealing with communication issues, especially working with seniors and their families. You've got family issues and all of that. And those obviously can come in and create a problem at the clinic or the business. What do you think is one of the best, or maybe just a few of the best ways that they can handle those kinds of issues that in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, the most inflamed client or patient you're going to get is one who doesn't feel like they're heard. So if there was a takeaway message, is be first to be able to hear the gravity or the details of the complaint that's coming in, regardless of the nature of it, regardless if there's harm, but you want to know from the patient or the client what they're most upset about, because if they don't feel heard, if you don't take that opportunity, and hopefully early on, after you've become made aware, they're going to find a way to be heard. So they're going to, and the internet makes every patient or client very savvy very quickly. So this could be a Google review, this could be Facebook, this could be even something you might not appreciate right away, which is they tell 10 of their friends not to use you. And that's that could be a book of business that 2 years from now that you just lost, or your main referral source. So they could go back to whoever referred you to them and say, yeah, that person that you sent to me, they were no good. Well, you're likely to not get a steady stream of referrals from that same referral source. So I think one of the big takeaways is making sure that you have some kind of process. And even if you don't, following up very quickly with individuals who've expressed the fact that they're dissatisfied, and especially if there's some harm related to their dissatisfaction in the service that you've provided.
I think that's very good advice and something that definitely every business, I mean, I don't even care if it's a healthcare clinic, every business
Yes.
should follow,
It,
honestly. So
absolutely.
what do you see as the biggest documentation mistake that most PTs or OTs, clinical uh, do? And how can they fix that? I remember as an OT, we had to document everything. And then I went through the evidence-based therapy process when HOAs first came out, and everything had to be evidence-based. And we had these little tiny boxes that we had to write, tiny, tons of information we'd end up writing on the back of the soap note. So, what do you see nowadays as any problems that therapists can fix in their documentation to, you know, uh, for risk management,
Protect himself. Yeah.
and to protect themselves and the clinic?
Yeah. You know, Documentation was always kind of a struggle for me in how laborious it was. So I'm very sensitive to the fact that you don't want to just add more fields to have to fill in. So I think one of the most important things that you can do when you're looking to protect your documentation is to add your clinical reasoning, because clinicians make decisions, and sometimes they're not the decision that you would make with every patient, or the most standard decision, or even the standard of care. But if you add your clinical reasoning in that assessment of why you did what you did, that goes a long way, because if you don't have information on the why you made the decision to put that handrail here or to walk with the cane instead of the walker because they demonstrated proficiency with the walker the previous 10 visits and it was an appropriate progression. But documenting the why and the clinical reasoning, it allows for there to be less guessing if there's a gap in the why that you did the thing you did in the note. So clinical reasoning is a big one. I also think sometimes we look at the subjective aspects of the clinical documentation as kind of just being fluff. We're just trying to put the S in of the SOAP note and
Yeah.
grab something. But I think that can be very helpful to also guide your decision making and letting the reader of that record, because in liability lawsuits, it really comes down to what was documented for that encounter. So using that subjective to capture, information that might be useful in driving your treatment plan. So I think using the subjective, whether that's pain or whether that's, hey, I'm really excited, I'm feeling much better after doing XYZ treatment last week. Can we do this again? Or try to use that subjective information to bolster your decision making.
That is all very good advice. I could have used that in writing my my notes.
Yeah.
Now, for the clinic, for the businesses that provide home health, is there any risk management for complying to HIPAA when someone is working in someone else's home?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, well, one of the riskier areas is when you're disclosing information to individuals that the patient hasn't necessarily said you can do. And it becomes gray when you have patients who have waxing and waning levels of cognition. Now, if they are their own person and they have capacity to make their own healthcare decisions, that means that they have the capacity to make the decisions on who's privy to their medical information also. So I think for consideration with therapists and businesses working in people's homes, just because that person is a family member and they call you and say, "Hey, how'd my aunt do?" or "Hey, how'd my mother do?" it doesn't necessarily mean that they're privy to all of that information. The other thing that you can kind of try to abide by is the minimal necessary rule in HIPAA, is that you're giving information that's only minimally necessary to the request. So it's not necessarily, if I said, I'd like my mother to know that I have treatment on Mondays and Wednesdays. That doesn't mean that that if the mother asks, "Hey, tell me about what the last 5 years of his medical history has looked like." So I would keep that in mind, that just because you're allowed to receive or give some information doesn't mean that you're allowed to receive or give all information.
Yeah, because it's so easy to do. Because when you're in a home setting, it's casual. You've got family members there. A lot of times, I think you assume that they should have this information. Maybe not every detail, but you're right. You don't always know that the patient has given permission or even wants that other person to know.
One of those areas could be like medications, for instance. If you're kind of reviewing a patient's medication list, I think it's, best practice to just be like, is this a good time to go over your medication list? Because as you go through that medication list, someone can deduce the fact that if you're taking a, medication for bipolar disorder, or if you're taking a medication for HIV, things like that. I think you want to be very mindful of, who's within an earshot of talking about or reviewing those medications. Something that can seem like, a very benign task to say, let's go through your medications and make sure you have them here and the doses are correct and it lines up with what your doctor's prescribed. It could be problematic if you're in a room full of people and you're going one by one through their medications.
Well, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. What do you see as upcoming trends or changes in the industry? especially when it pertains to, aging in place or seniors and family caregivers? Are there any changes? Is AI altering anything? Is, the way healthcare is changing, altering anything?
Yeah, we see more telehealth. So there's a big, broad expansion of telehealth. So with the more broad expansion of the telehealth services and the delivery of care, especially for rehab, I think you just want to be mindful that if there are aspects of an evaluation, for instance, that you can't capture, that you want to make sure that you in a normal situation, if you were, physically with the patient, you would have captured this, or that you couldn't assess this because of X, Y, and Z. So again, this lends to the idea that you're documenting your clinical reasoning for why you did what you did, because oftentimes the standard of care is based on what would a reasonable clinician do for that patient with that condition. So I think, keeping that in mind, you know, AI is trending in the direction where a lot of, in-person clinics are going to be using ambient scribing to do their documentation. So there could be some risk if this comes to the home health arena where you're bringing in I think in the future, you know, this could be out there where you're bringing in a device that does the listening and helps generate your documentation to make the home health documentation less cumbersome. So I think there could be some, privacy risks or concerns with that. There's always the risk of skill degradation when your skills, because you're not doing it as much, deteriorate over time. So I think you want to be mindful of that. Kind of trends in the industry. Liability insurance oftentimes it tends to go up. If you have certain claims that come out, like, falls are a big one, especially in the home health setting. If you're doing pelvic health and women's health has become, and for men and women really, has become more popular. And there's a lot of therapists who are getting into that. So I think how you're assessing those patients, potentially needing chaperones, or if there are patients who are sensitive to a sensitive exam of the pelvic area, things like that, I think are trends in the industry for risk management. So having a process for how you're going to be doing those, sensitive exams or assessments, especially if it's in the home and you feel uncomfortable. And let's say you have a business of, 3 pelvic health PTs who go into the homes, have a process for how you're going to manage those situations where one party might not be super comfortable unless they've got another set of eyes in the room with them. So things like that. I'm not exactly sure how that's going to play into home health in the upcoming years, but I think, that would be a few of them.
Yeah, I mean, home health, I think is definitely going to keep growing because it cuts the cost of so much healthcare, potentially, depending on the diagnosis. You mentioned Scribe and something else
Yeah.
before. Are those programs that
Ambient
like you
scribing
can
is
use?
Yeah, ambient scribing, I think when you're gonna see this as you go into, like, primary care visits and things. So for your aging community there, you may being be asked to consent for the fact that there's a listening device. So this is not a particular program. There's a lot of programs out there that do it, but you you probably have patients or individuals listening who've had a third party in the room with them who's been doing the typing while they're seen by their PA or their
Right.
doctor. And I think I know, specifically in dermatology, because they see such a high volume, they may have a person who's scribing and putting that information in the note. I think you're going to start to see listening devices that are capturing well, I know we're seeing that, capturing the noise of the room, that's then documenting that into the chart, and then, whoever the provider is kind of signing off on that as their note for the day. So
I
I think we're gonna see more of that.
Boy, you got to be careful what you say in there. And that.
Yeah.
Do do you ever walk into a clinic or walk, and find that there's very minimal work to do, or do you find that you have a lot to do in most of the clinics that you walk into, be it large or small?
Yeah, most of the time there's opportunities for improvement in the way that the adverse outcomes of the patient complaints or the documentation is being handled. There's usually opportunities to bolster the policy that will decrease, the burden of how much people have to work on it later on. So a lot of the situations that come up there, they're not always situations that happen every day. They might be one-offs that happen every 3 months, and there's no policy or procedure or really experience for hey, what do we do in this situation? So I tend to have a lot of work in that. Also, just educating on existing policies. So some business owners don't want to be the one to take to their staff, hey, this is our policy on social media or our use of AI. And they'd like someone else to take a look at the policy and then educate their staff on it. So I do see that. So, but the good thing about a lot of the therapy business is you're not going to be facing, multi-million dollar lawsuits oftentimes. We're not doing surgery in the homes. As the scope grows, we do more intricate care. There may be dry needling. You're using different devices. You might be ambulating outside. Different. There's always different environments when you're in home health. So I think sometimes there's businesses that don't need a ton of help, but they do like to have the support of to be able to pick up the phone and call someone when this patient has a service animal and what questions can I ask them? Or, oh, we think this person might be intoxicated. Should we be calling and notifying someone? Or they just had a fall and they hit their head, but they don't want me to call their daughter. What's the best way to document this? Or should we call their daughter? So I think stuff like that, there's usually areas for opportunity.
So when you go in, do you provide a resource like an FAQ kind of something, or do you have something on your website, whatever, for those kinds of questions, or do you want them to pick up the phone and call you?
For the businesses, I provide like a one pager that says like, "Hey," because a lot of them don't necessarily know what they don't know, so they don't know what to reach out for in terms of risk management. So I'll usually send a one pager and say, "Hey, these are the types of things that I work and consult on." And a lot of times they'll have like a policy of like, this happened and we don't really know how to handle it. And I say, well, we can create like a guideline or a policy that your practice has so that you're not scrambling every time it comes up and it takes you 3 hours to figure it out. You can, and the other thing is you want to be able to you handle each case is different, but you want to be able to handle them with a very similar approach. You get better at the approach that you're handling patient complaints with. And then also patients don't feel like they're being discriminated against or they're being, treated a different way for some reason.
Right. I'm sure you want to, as part, I mean, do you speak to the team when you're there? To raise this like, what do you call, like a risk awareness culture in the group? Is that part of what you do as well?
It is, yeah. So depending on the business and how many employees they have and what their needs are and how proactive they are about the risk management of their business, yes, this a lot of times this has to do with, staff education and delivering a message to staffers, simple things as, if this happens, if this fall happens, these are the things you'd want to consider to collect in your documentation. So provide fall huddle forms to different businesses where they say, this is the service we do. And I say, well, if you have a fall, you might want to capture this and put this information in your electronic medical record. I think it helps the client or the patient too, right? So that there's a thorough assessment done when there's been a changing condition with a patient or a client. When something happens that you didn't anticipate, what do you do? Who do you tell? And what type of information do you make sure you capture? And what aspects of the assessment should you be assessing?
I think it is very important to know the information that the information that you capture, what is needed, because otherwise you're constantly going back, fixing, the gap that wasn't there.
And then
For
if you have someone who's upset, right, and they
Yeah,
and they're they've got a grievance with the care that they received a month ago, they're not likely to get very good answers on that if there's very limited documentation on the things that they're most concerned about. So one of the defensive strategies is to put nothing sometimes for people, for, therapists, and that doesn't work out well because then you go back and the client feels like you tried to hide it. Or the client says, "Oh, you're not telling the truth about that." And the business owner might be the one who's trying to explain what happened and they've got nothing to go on. So it can be a challenge.
absolutely. Now, in the aging in place niche, what I encourage a lot of aging in place specialists is to, create that Rolodex of other services that their patient, their client can use. A contractor walks into a home to put in grad bars, but if they're CAP certified or trained in aging in place, they might identify that, flooring needs to be changed, or that the person isn't, the mobility issues are. So if they're then turning around and recommending a PT clinic or, a OT, whatever, what are the risks? What do they have to think about as far as risk management in that process, in the recommendation process, or do they?
Well, if they're making if they're making a recommendation that's something that it's part of the care that they're providing under the license, then that is, that they'd want to make sure that they've got professional liability coverage that's going to cover them in the decisions that they make in their healthcare delivery. So if you're providing an occupational therapy service, I think the other thing you want to consider is, sometimes in these cases, you may want to know that the people that you're referring others to have general liability coverage, are licensed in the state. You're not necessarily going to be on the hook for that. I don't think it's something that we want therapists to really be worrying about. I think they should feel confident in the fact that they can make referrals to certain, agencies or contractors or what have you. But I think you want to do a little bit of your own due diligence to ensure that they do good work. I don't think you've got to be vetting them, but if someone's asking you to refer your clients to them, you may want to say get a little more information on them. I don't think you have to do a full vetting process, but I wouldn't just offer out referrals willy nilly, especially if you're getting some kind of kickback for that referral for home services work.
Right.
Because then that could potentially come back to bite you. You make a referral, you've got that documented. They use that individual, and that individual robs them blind or puts in something that's not up to code, and then they have a fall or an injury or damage to their house. I think it ends up just getting a little bit hairy that way. So becoming a member of a group that has even if it's just reputable businesses, I think that's and if someone's coming and asking you, offering to give you a kickback on the referrals, I think you want to be mindful of that and, maybe make sure that you're going through the vetting process a little more closely with those businesses.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Because I mean, there is some risk in there somewhere, for sure. With so many people these days using chat, my counselor is concerned that her patients are coming in saying, "I'm using chat." You know, I thought that that can be very dangerous. But number one, you don't want to be putting personal information out there,
Mhm.
names and dates and anything like that, because I tell people it all goes into a major library, if you want to think of it that way, and it's in there. So, what can when a therapist walks in and the patient is telling them, "Well, I'm using chat to help me with my medication management and, my therapy and whatever," what can um, what can a clinician do uh, in that instance? I was thinking, I told my therapist that, she should work with them on that. If they're going to be, using it, then use it with them because it's not going to go away. So how can you make it safer, not only for the patient, but for the therapist as well? I think. What do you
I
think?
think you got Yeah, I think you gotta be open to the idea that they're gonna use it. I don't think you can tell them not to. I think you gotta
Right.
let them know that the big risks are with privacy, so that anything that you put into that cloud, there's no guarantees on where that's gonna show up 5 or 10 years from now, or that
Yeah.
that isn't gonna be subject to some breach that's then, gonna have your information used in a way that you really didn't intend it to be used. In terms of like the clinical recommendations, I mean, it does make errors. I think it's getting better by the day, but it does make errors. And I think, ultimately you're as the provider of care, you're going to be held to whatever the reasonable standard of care is at that time. So if a patient says, well, ChatGPT tells me to do this, maybe you want to consider it, but I wouldn't let it alter your decision making and the recommendations that you're going to make. But I think ultimately you're going to be met with patients who've punched in their symptoms and they say, well, what about this? And I think you should probably consider what they say the answer is. And if you're
Right.
going to do something different because it's not clinically appropriate, offer an
Right.
explanation. I think it's making this really challenging. kind of in this space where it's really challenging for providers in their delivery of care. And there isn't a real precedent on how this is going to get handled. And I think one of the reasons there isn't full adoption in some areas is because of the privacy risks, because these are cloud based and who knows where that information's going.
It's true. I mean, if I was, running a home health agency and the therapists that I'm sending out come back to me and are telling me that their patients, are using Chat or Perplexity or whatever AI program, um, yeah, I mean, you want to have some kind of protocol or something to give to the therapist to help them deal with the situation. But you're right, it's constantly changing. It's in that whole process now of evolution. So what may work today may not work next week. So I can see that being a problem for the moment. Who knows? And like you said, who knows where it's going to end up?
Yeah,
It,
yeah, ever
yeah,
changing.
it's gonna be a wild ride for the next few years,
Mhm.
I think. If there's any one myth that prevents a clinic or a business from using your services, what do you think it would be? What is stopping them, or what keeps them from moving ahead with doing something that really could end up saving them so much time, money, effort in the long run?
I think one thing that's not really understood super well is the delineation between what your attorney does and what risk management does. Risk management, especially in the capacity that I deliver it, helps to reduce liability. I'm not necessarily drawing up, third party vendor contracts. That's more appropriate for a healthcare attorney to do. If you've got Medicare billing infractions, that's not something that I'm going to be helping you with. But if you want to create processes to prevent liability risk or licensure risk or reputational damage in the business, that's kind of more the risk management realm. I think risk managers are oftentimes much more suited to give guidance on how to manage the real time situations with your patients or your clients. So I think that's usually where it's helpful. Risk management, if you have kind of a professional who's on retainer or a phone call away, they typically will, in best practice, know about your business, so know best how to handle it. So I think, one of the things that it's just not super well understood at times is the difference in that, and how risk managers are, typically a lot more closer to the healthcare delivery or the delivery of the service. And it's really more of a partnership in offering recommendations so that the business owner can focus on growth and satisfying their clients with the delivery of service. The other, I think, thing that's not considered, Esther, is you've got to buy liability insurance. And the way that they rate what your premium is going to be is how risky your business is. What is the likelihood that you're going to incur some loss? And they've got to adjust and offer a premium that you're going to pay monthly or yearly that's going to cover you in that. One of the ways that you can decrease the risk of loss of any asset in your business is by the things that I do. So it's possible that if you've got risk management support, your business is seen as a less risky business, a less risky asset to insure. And therefore, the underwriters and the insurance companies see that as less of a risk to them, and therefore you may see a benefit in your premiums, or you may not see as much of an increase. So there's certain policies that your business could have in place that they'll say when they go to do your renewal and say, okay, you're up for a renewal to get your professional liability or your general liability, tell me X, Y, and Z about your business. There's certain things you can have in place that they will see you as less risky, and you may save some money.
That is a very good point. It's a good tagline. Now, when you're looking over the business, do you also look over their online information, their website, or anything that they put out, PDFs, whatever? Do you look at that too?
That's one area that's not actually commonly asked about, but I do get asked about the communications. So if you're putting out communications to patients or communications to the public, especially if you're offering some service and what you think the outcome is going to be, are you listing it as guarantees? There's certain things in your online communications that as I work with the businesses, I could say, you know what, I might say this and I might not say that. So I think drafting the communications that go out to patients and clients, or drafting the language, looking at it from a risk perspective, is something I do. But I haven't done a ton of, looking over, all existing media that a business has out there. But I have been sent, hey, I'm about to put this up on my website, or, we want to send this flyer out, or we just had this happen and we want to tell our clients that, unfortunately, abruptly, we're now only open till noon. Like, how do we craft that language? So
Yeah.
I think crafting the communications, yes.
Yeah, I think that is very important. Yeah, I mean, I was thinking of, there some companies put out articles, blogs, whatever. Obviously, almost everybody has a little disclaimer at the bottom of the site or whatever. But is that enough? I don't know. Who knows? So where are your services nationwide, or are they
Yeah.
only? Okay, so
Yeah, wherever. I've got my own errors and emissions liability insurance, but yeah, I can serve any anywhere that can pick up a phone or go on a Zoom call. I sit here in Massachusetts. So we've got healthcare practices, and I'm in Western Massachusetts here, but yeah, pretty much can do either topic specific or education to staff, or even just working with the business owner to have a conversation about where I think the greatest risks may be, or maybe what their biggest pain points are. And I can tell you, hey, that's something I can help out with, or maybe I'm not best to handle.
yeah,
Depends.
but only in the United States, or do you do Canada as well?
Yeah, there's nothing stopping me from doing that. I haven't. I think I've had like one inquiry from Europe. A individual hit me up on the website, but I haven't done any work outside of the country really. So, but if there's a lot of the stuff is similar, a lot of the ideas and the concepts are
Mhm,
similar.
mhm.
If they're in an area that has very specific laws, it'd be something I'd have to look into, and they may be better off going with a healthcare attorney in their respective country. But usually, I'll tell someone that. I won't try to take on anything I can't do.
Yeah. So if it's a local area that you can access, that you can get to, do you go to visit them?
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of it can be really beneficial to kind of see what the business looks like, see what the care that or the service that they're delivering looks like. Go out to their place or meet with them in person. There's a lot of added value to doing that, especially when I worked in the health systems. A lot of the work can be done remote, but going out and being in front of the people, you're more likely to get, pressing questions. Hey, they're more likely to ask you if you're, 10 feet away from them than if you're on a Zoom call and they feel a little bit uneasy in front of the crowd. So I think it's helpful to get out there. So yeah, yeah, reasonable distance. I'm willing to, and if it's a larger business, I'm happy to
Sure.
go there and do a risk assessment.
Sure. But what if it's somebody, you're in Massachusetts, what if it's somebody in Texas? Do you ask them for photos of the clinic or video or anything like that? Is that part of the process?
If they have concerns, let's say if they owned the property and they have concerns about a certain area, the most likely scenario was someone would reach out to me, which this has not happened, but someone would reach out to me and say, we've got this issue with the front parking lot. We've had two people fall on. Do you think we need to do anything about this? Or we've got, five people we treat in this room here. It would be good to have a picture of what the room looks like, or, you know, how it's set up, things like that. So sometimes there's added benefit to seeing the space and the stuff, but it
Right.
really depends on what the clinic's needs are. So a lot of this can be done remotely.
Okay. Good. It sounds great. I mean, it sounds like such an interesting part of healthcare that I never really looked at. Being an OT, I'm so you head in with the patients and you don't really see the other side, the risk management side. But wow, you've taught me a lot today. And I think it's such an interesting field to go into. And the fact that you had physical therapy experience beforehand, I mean, you can almost see the processes and things that the clinicians themselves are going through, which I think
I
is
think
a huge benefit.
it helps in the conversation that, I've kind of been in the shoes that a lot of these, therapists. I know what it's like to be in front of a patient. I know what it's like to be in a hospital or a clinic or a home, someone's home that's not set up very well or has its own risks. So yeah,
Yeah, I think I read somewhere that less than 10% of homes in the US are age friendly.
Oh, you know what? That's wild, but I guess I believe it, right? I mean, yeah, that makes sense. Like,
It's crazy.
right.
And I also read that 2026 is the year that the oldest baby boomers start turning 80.
Oh, wow, really? Oh my goodness.
So that is just going to keep growing. And I think
Yeah.
someone just told me earlier this week that by 2030, we'll have more older adults than younger in the US. So that
Wow.
demographic is it's exploding. So I can
Yes.
how clinics and physicians and healthcare providers are easily going into their own, opening up their own thing to provide these services, like the concierge doctors. I don't blame them for wanting to get away from the entrapments of the larger corporations. I don't blame them.
Yeah, the big box model has definitely got some of its downsides.
Yeah. Well, like everything. So how can people contact you? How can they get a hold of you?
My website is rehabriskconsulting.com. My email address is muzar@rehabriskconsulting.com. I got an Instagram page too that I'll post like little different tips or videos on, kind of rehab related or risk related stuff. That's rehab_risk_consulting. So those are usually the best way. Shoot me an email even if you have questions, or if you have, folks in your aging community cohort there, if they've got any questions about, hey, what's the best way to approach something if they're on the other side of it, because there is a certain, maybe a certain tact or a certain way to get a response to a, a poor experience or outcome that you have.
Very good. Very good. Thank you so much, Michael. I so appreciate it. Stay on a little bit. I want to thank
Yeah.
everybody for listening. I'll have all of that information in the show notes and descriptions and everything else for the podcast and the YouTube channel. So thank you very much, and we'll see everybody next time.